Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Tykus Teaches You Stuff. Today we're going to talk weapon damage, and I will do my best to make an apples-to-apples explanation of damage, how it's calculated, and weighting and where it fits in. We are going to look into 5 different weapon properties and how they figure into damage application and critical rank. First will be enchanting. We're going to take a look at both a plain Jane 0x weapon and a 4x weapon. We will dig into a little bit to critical weighting, damage weighting, how flares can help, as well as the elemental spell of Elemental Blade. This is a block of text you should all be very familiar with. This is just going to be our generic swing for the day. We will be using a two-handed sword. Our attack strength is 255. Our adversary has a defense strength of 200. We're going to use an AVD, an attack versus defense of 45. We'll maintain a die roll of 50 with an end roll of 150. A little bit of business here you'll have to keep track of. This information is from the two-handed sword page, and it gives us some pieces of information that are very important. These 3 will be very important in figuring out our damage for today. You'll see that our AVD is 45 in our formula, and we look down at our chart and we see that an AVD of 45 means that we're swinging against something that is wearing leather armor of armor subgroup 5. And because of that, we have a damage factor, a DF of 0.500. And this weapon does either slash or crush damage. And if we look up at our descriptor sentence from our attack, we'll see it as a slashing blow to the chest, which means that we are going to use slash damage, and we will maintain it always being a chest wound. Our first weapon here will be a 0x non-weighted weapon. We will kind of use this as our baseline swing, and you can make our comparisons off of that. The attack form is exactly the same, and we maintain an end roll of 150. That is the most important part of determining damage and critical rank. It doesn't matter how big or small the attack strength and the defense strength are. When determining damage, all that matters is the end roll. To determine the amount of damage that we will apply to our adversary and the critical rank of a wound we will inflict, we need to determine both raw damage and critical rank. Raw damage is simply the end roll minus 100 multiplied by the DF, the damage factor. And we looked earlier and saw that this damage factor is going to be 0.500. So 150 end roll minus 100 is 50. Multiply that by our DF of 0.500, and we end up with a raw damage of 25. Using this, we can determine our critical rank. Critical rank is just raw damage divided by your armor crit divisor. Armor crit divisor is another value that is used to determine what our critical rank is going to be. Each group of armor has its own crit divisor, and here's a little list so you can see what they are. Cloth you divide by 5, leather by 6, scale by 7, chain by 9, plate by 11. So you can see the harder the armor, the lower the crit rank will be. Today we're going to use a crit divisor of 6, and you can see that in our next formula here. Our raw damage divided by our armor crit divisor, which is 6, so 25 divided by 6 gives us a value of 4.166, and our calculation tells us to truncate that. So we end up with a rank 4 critical. If we dig into the wiki page, we can find the chart for slash damage and scroll down to chest, and you'll see that a rank 4 critical to the chest has 20 additional damage. It will apply a 3-round stun and a rank 2 wound. If we take all of this into consideration, we can see this is where we get our 45 points of damage. We get 25 from our raw damage, and 20 from the additional crit damage of a rank 4 wound. We will use this as our baseline swing and baseline damage, so we'll need to remember that a rank 4 wound does 20 damage, and the overall damage was 45, just so we can make comparisons down the line. Our next weapon will be a 4X no-weighted weapon. This is just a plain Jane Voltite weapon that you would pick up at the armor. The biggest things you're going to notice is our attack strength has gone up from 255 to 275, which increases our end roll accordingly. Our swing, instead of 45 damage, has done 60 points of damage, and we have a crossing slash to the chest, so we're still maintaining a slash wound to the chest, though our descriptor sentence is slightly different. Here is our formula. Our raw damage is still our end roll of 170 minus 100, so that is 70 multiplied by 0.500, our damage factor. That gives us an overall raw damage of 35. When we determine our critical rank, we take our raw damage of 35, divide it by our armor crit divisor of 6, which gives us a value of 5.833. We then truncate that and determine we have a rank 5 critical. We dig back into the wiki and determine that a rank 5 critical does 25 damage this time, as opposed to 20 of a rank 4, so there's 5 additional damage. This applies a 5-round stun as opposed to a 3-round stun, which is always handy, and we also maintain the same rank 2 wound. Our total damage will then end up as 60, 35 being raw damage, 25 being crit damage. As you may have expected, a 4X weapon is more effective at applying damage than a 0X weapon, and here you can see the breakdown of how exactly that works out. Essentially, any way you can push up that end roll will in turn push up your raw damage and give you a better chance of jumping to the next rank in critical hit, and that is always a good thing. Moving on, we're going to look at a 0X heavy crit weighted two-handed sword. For our purposes, this would be 10 points of critical weighting or a combat effectiveness rating of 10. You'll see that our attack strength has dropped back down to 255, and our end roll is now back at 150. Looking at our formulas, we can see that our raw damage is exactly as it originally was at 25, but things let's start to look a little different here when we look into our critical rank. This is where crit weighting comes in. Critical weighting is applied to the raw damage only in this formula. It is often referred to as phantom damage because it doesn't apply to that damage line, only when determining the rank of the critical that is possible. So we take our raw damage and we add our crit weighting, and then we divide by our armor crit divisor, and you can see here, right here is where our crit weighting goes. We take our raw damage of 25, add 10, that gives us 35, divide by 6, which once again gives us 5.833, which truncates into a rank 5 critical hit. Our total damage comes to 50 with 25 raw damage and 25 crit damage, which is slightly higher than our OX not crit weighted weapon because it actually pushed us from a rank 4 to a rank 5 wound. Next up is a 0X heavy damage weighted weapon. Once again, for our purposes, this will be 10 points of damage weighting or a combat effectiveness rating of 10. Our attack strength and our end roll are the same with an end roll of 150. Our formulas look exactly the same as our plain Jane 0X weapon did. We have 25 points of raw damage and we have a rank 4 critical. The only place that damage weighting comes into effect is at the end. It is not figured into raw damage and it is not figured into your critical rank. It is just added to the end of every hit. So we have 25 points of raw damage, 20 points from our crit, and we have our 10 points of damage weighting. This is just sheer hit point damage and will not push your attack into the next critical at any point. Next up is flares. This example, we're going to use a 0X fire flaring weapon. And you can see our attack strength is 255, our end roll is 150, and you can see that our two-handed sword flares with a burst of flames, and we get an extra 15 points of damage. That 15 points of damage is what we're going to pay attention to, along with our end roll of 150. The math should all look very similar. 25 points of raw damage, a rank 4 critical, and our flares get added here to the very end. We have 25 points of raw damage, 20 points of crit damage, and 15 points of fire flare. This is very similar to damage weighting. It's just an easier way to get it, and it only happens once every, 6 or 7 swings. Now, this only applies that I'm talking to here about the 5 elemental flares. There are dozens of other kinds of flares which are super effective and super crazy and a lot of fun, but I'm not going to talk about those. They are a beast of their own. And lastly, we're going to talk about Elemental Blade, or an E-Blade. I think it often gets overlooked and can be super useful early on in the game. It's easy to get. It doesn't really cost you anything. And we'll show how it is against some of these other weapons as far as damage goes. Once again, it is the spell 411. It's the Minor Elemental Circle, and it's called Elemental Blade. As we look at the attack line here, we'll see that because of the 4x enchantment from the spell, our attack strength goes up to 275, which pushes our end roll up to 170, which you've already determined is a good thing. We also get the flare, in this case fire, and the additional 15 points of damage. If we dig into the math, we see that because of the 4x enchantment, our raw damage is up at 35, which in turn pushes our critical rank to rank 5. So when we do the calculation of the total damage, including the fire flares, we get 35 from raw damage, 25 from the rank 5 critical, and then the additional 15 from the fire flares. And as is with any elemental flare, this can be from 5 points of damage all the way to 60 points of damage, and happens about every 6 swings or so. I just wanted to touch base on that and make sure it didn't get overlooked, because it is fairly useful and as a great tool early on in the game. Now, as an overview, enchantment increases both damage and increases our critical chance. And that is all from just pushing up the end roll. Like I said earlier, anything you can do to push up your end roll will increase both raw damage and the chance to push into the next critical rank. We've learned that crit weighting increases just the crit chance, and if you are able to jump up to the next crit ranking, there is the chance you'll get a little more damage based on that. The big thing about crit weighting and why everybody loves it is there is always the chance that the next crit level has the fatal crit. If you're aiming for either the eyes or the head or the neck, there's a very good chance you can push into a fatal crit range. Or if you have enough critical weighting on your weapon, such as the inherent critical weighting of a claymore, then you can often get into that fatal crit range. Even though it doesn't increase your overall damage, you're betting on the chance that it's going to get into one of those fatal crit categories. We also learned that damage weight increases just hit point damage only. Never going to push you into that fatal range. You're just going to beat the thing to death using damage. It does come into play later on in the game when your end rolls are pretty high, and you're always getting into that rank 5 through 9 critical range, and the only thing you can do to improve your chances is just increase damage. Personally, I think flares are gravy and go good on everything, and with the new weighting system, you can have flares and weighting, and there are cases where you can have 2 sets of flares. And don't be afraid to use Elemental Blade. It can be your friend early on. All right, so finishing up here, we're going to touch on a couple of the downers. Crit randomization. This comes into play when you're calculating the critical rank. This chart here will show us that anytime that you calculate your critical rank, there is always a chance that it will work its way down into a lower critical. Today, most of our math stayed in the rank 4 to rank 5 categories. And all of the calculations we did were figured out on the actual a rank 5 critical math staying as a rank 5, but any of those could have dropped down into the categories you see. Even though the raw damage and our crit weight pushed us into a rank 5 hit, the game could have randomized you down all the way to a 3, and if had it been a rank 4, it could have randomized you down to a rank 2. They just do that for some flavor in the game, and not everything is quite so predictable. But there's the chart you can see. And last thing, I swear, is padding, natural or otherwise. There are many creatures in the game that have some sort of inherent padding, either critical or damage padding, and here is where they fall into our formulas. Crit padding is taken into account at the same place that we would have added crit weighting. So if we have 10 points of crit weighting and our adversary has 10 points of crit padding, they negate each other. Same goes when we calculate total overall damage. It's our raw damage plus our crit damage plus our damage weight, and then we would subtract any damage padding that our opponent has. It can be a bit of a bummer when you're doing really well and the creature you're attacking just doesn't seem to be dying, and this is often why I don't think it is fully understood which creatures have padding and which ones don't, how much there is, and exactly how they apply to us. But this is the overall accepted how padding applies against weighting. Lastly, a couple of resources. The wiki is amazing. These are where you can find your critical tables as well to the overall weapon table, so you can figure out what your damage factor, your attack versus defense, and what sort of weapon types do what sort of damage types. Thank you for sticking around and listening to me. I hope you enjoyed this and maybe learned something. If you did enjoy it, please like, subscribe, and stick a comment down below. This has been Tykus Teaches You Stuff. I'm Tykus, and I hope you guys all have a great day.